Hello, I'm Nicole Carroll, Editor-in-Chief of USA Today, and we appreciate you joining us this evening. Tonight, we're going to discuss how institutions of power both fuel and stall change, including law enforcement, media, government, and education. This event is part of USA Today's 7 Days of 1961 project, a multimedia series spotlighting 7 pivotal protests that fueled the civil rights movement and helped lead to the end of some legal segregation policies and extend voting rights to Black Americans. I'd like to introduce Deborah Berry, a USA Today national correspondent who covers voting rights, race, and other issues. Deborah came to us with this project earlier this year, and we are so happy and so proud to be able to share it with all of you today. Deb?
Good evening, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. This project comes more than a year after the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other Black Americans. It comes amid a national debate over systemic racism, voting access, how we teach our history, and what roles institutions such as the police, media, and government play in making our society fair for all. For many years, I've wanted to collect the stories of civil rights veterans before they go on to glory, as the old folks would say. These freedom fighters made it possible for more Black Americans to go to college, to vote, to register to vote, to travel freely, to practice freedom of speech, and even become journalists at major news organizations. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. And in a nod to the mass meetings of the 1960s, we wanted to open up this program with a freedom song. And who better to do that than one of the original freedom singers? With that, I'm going to introducing Mr. Chuck Neblett. He's a civil rights activist and a founding member of the Freedom Singers, which was a musical group that raised awareness about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Mr. Neblett, in a video, is singing Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, which was one of the key freedom songs that was sung throughout the South.
Eyes on the prize. Paul and Silas bound in jail, had no money for to go their bail. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Paul and Silas began to shout. The jail doors open and they walked out. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Jordan's river is deep and wide. I get my freedom on the other side. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. I never been to heaven, but I know I'm right. People up there have their civil rights. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. The only thing that we did wrong, stayed in the wilderness a day too long. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Only thing that we did right was the day we decided to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
Was beautiful. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our moderator and our panelists tonight. And we have a few. Ms. Kim Jackson serves as the senator for Georgia's 41st Senate District. She has spent a decade serving in the Episcopal Church and is a nationally renowned consultant and preacher. Gerard Robinson is Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies in Culture Foundation at the University of Virginia. Brenda Travis is a civil rights veteran who attempted to integrate a bus station in her hometown of Macomb, Mississippi in 1961 when she was only 16. She is the co-author of her memoir, Mississippi's Exiled Daughter, How My Civil Rights Baptism Under Fire Shaped My Life. Derek Johnson, president of the NAACP, was scheduled to be with us tonight, but we just learned that he won't be able to be here. Now I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Daphne Chamberlain. Dr. Chamberlain is an associate professor of history at Tougaloo College in Mississippi and a scholar of civil rights history, particularly the Mississippi freedom struggle.
Thanks, Deborah. And thanks to USA Today for having me and partnering with Tougaloo College this evening. It's my pleasure to serve. To our viewing audience, before we begin, we want to let you all know that we will be taking a few questions later on in the evening. So please feel free to place your questions in the chat and we will get to as many of them as possible. So again, we will have questions later on in the evening and our support staff will collect all of those questions for you. Again, it's my pleasure to serve. And we have a wonderful roster of panelists this evening. And we want to start this evening's panel with personal reflections from each of our guests. All of you all have been pivotal in shaping public discourse around social justice and social injustice, particularly when it comes to civil rights and freedom for African Americans. Based on your perception, how has the long civil rights movement been shaped by the actions of law enforcement, by the actions of the media, government, and/or education leaders? And second, what are some moments that stand out to you in your personal journey as change agents? And we can begin with any of our panelists this evening.
Well, how about this? I'll begin. Again, I'm Kim Jackson, and so grateful to be able to be here. I'm bringing you greetings from, ironically, Stone Mountain, Georgia, the heart of and the seat of the Ku Klux Klan, where it began, and yet now is a place in which the majority of us who live here and who play on Stone Mountain are Black Americans. So a different place. When I think about the role of media in particular, when it comes to the civil rights movement, I think about those iconic photos, those iconic videos and photos of people with hoses being sprayed down by police officers on horses with batons, which remind me of, the images that we just saw last week of police officers on horses, this time roping down people who were from Haiti. I think about those iconic images and how they sparked and encouraged people from all across the nation to get involved. I'm an Episcopal priest, and so there were a number of Episcopalians who in the 60s went down to the South because they were inspired by those videos. And then when I think about today's present day civil rights movement, again, I think about those iconic those iconic videos. So, we think about George Floyd and us all, an entire world watching that video, and how it brought us as masses all around this country and indeed the world out, because the media was able to show us right in front of our eyes, again, the horror of what it is to be Black in these United States. And so I think for me, the role that media has played, and some of that social media, some of that is media like US Today, has been so pivotal in helping to have people have a greater awareness. As a Black American who grew up in the South and lives in the South, I don't necessarily need to see those videos. But in order to really bring forward a huge outcry and a true movement, we've needed those videos, we've needed those pictures in order to help spark a movement towards us. And it's often after those iconic moments that we've seen where government has in turn responded and sought to change laws to make this place a little bit better.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Anyone else willing to answer this particular question for this evening's discussion?
Well, I'd like to join. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I want to follow up on something that Senator Jackson just said as relates to seeing images. So I grew up in Los Angeles, California, first in my family to graduate from college. And 30 years ago this month, I began teaching at the Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles. And I showed Eyes on the Prize to the students. And I'll never forget when they watched a lot of the stills or a lot of the movement, and it was all in black and white. And then at some point in watching one of the videos, one of the students said, "Hey, wait a minute, these people are in color." And all of a sudden, the students stopped talking and watching TV. And one of the students stood up and said, "Oh, I guess this stuff really did happen." I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Because they're in color." And so all of a sudden, understanding that black and white did not mean unreal, but to a generation of young students who grew up only seeing color television, or if you're a certain age, knowing that at one point you can watch television, and then a Native American would come on board, and that will let you know it's time to turn off the TV. But it was a very pivotal moment in understanding the role of media and images in shaping how young people think. And so that shifted a few things I did as a teacher. On a personal note, I grew up in Los Angeles. My goal was to become a professional football player. It wasn't to become a college graduate. A lot of the guys who I grew up with in Los Angeles knew there were three exits out of the neighborhood: violence, academics, or sports. I grew up in a gang neighborhood, but wasn't a gangster. I wasn't strong in academics, but I was pretty good in sports. And so as life would have it, I found myself getting hurt my senior year, and then reality set in. I finished high school without having algebra, never had biology or any real courses to prepare me for college. I enrolled into a community college, worked full time, and lo and behold, it was Black college graduates who would come through my line at Ralph's grocery store to talk to me about life and staying in school. It was the importance of educators, particularly those who went to HBCUs like a Tougaloo, who said, your destiny today doesn't have to be framed by what was in the past, but in the future. So through that experience, I decided to go to Howard University, graduated, and then became a lifelong educator. So when I think about Mississippi today and the fact that it is the only state to see major gains in three of the core subjects in NAEP, that's a long way from 1961. But I also remember that when I look at, prepping for today, that it was 9 students at Tougaloo who decided they wanted to actually walk into a library that was segregated to have a read in. And what role that later played in not only desegregating the library in that city, but helping push the conversation we have today. So educators and students have played a tremendous role in not only my personal life, but all of us on this conversation today. So I think education will remain a platform for moving the civil rights conversation.
Thank you. And you talk about the power of images, and especially with the media. The Tougaloo 9 is one, but also when we think about students in Macomb, Mississippi, and there is an iconic image of students walking out of Berglund High School. So, Ms. Travis, would you like to take an opportunity to answer the question as well?
Yes, I was just waiting my turn, which is, but I just left Jackson this past weekend, excuse me, with a similar panel where we discussed the 60s and the walkouts. and civil rights and the impact that it has on today's young people. And I alluded to the fact that I have a foundation in Macomb, and how I take time to go into the schools to share with people, young people, I'm sorry, our experience as civil rights activists, and to make them aware of how and where they are today was as a result of a price that somebody paid along the way. And Mr. Robinson alluded to um, the black and white photos, and I shared with the students little excerpts of the fire department and the police, where the fire department washing bodies down the street as though that power from the fire hoses. I don't know how many tons of power, but it would take a person 100, 200 pounds or so and wash it down the street as though it was a piece of paper. And the dogs, well, the students thought it was hilarious. It was black and white. I had to stop the presentation in order to explain to them that this actually happened. So somewhere along the way, we didn't do our due diligence um, after we left Macomb, after we left Mississippi. Uh, the students should have continued. We should have continued to teach the students, and that's the strongest and most powerful weapon we can have today, is to teach them.
Thank you, Ms. Travis. And that reminds me of Nelson Mandela's quote: the most powerful tool which we could use to change the world is education. Before we move into our next question, I'll turn it back over to Deborah, because we have another panelist who's joined us for the evening. Deborah.
Thank you, Daphne. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jamal Green. He's a community advocate, a political strategist, and a former Chicago mayoral candidate. He has worked with Black Lives Matter social justice movement and other organizations to highlight police violence and economic disparities. Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain.
Thank you. So at this moment in time, we'll move into our second question for the evening for our panelists. And that question is, what parallels, if any, do you see in the conversations we are having today around racial justice with the debates that unfolded in the 1960s around integration and equal rights? So Jamal, would you like to jump in and answer this question before we move to our next panelist for answers?
Yeah, no, I would love to. I think, there are a lot of different parallels we can look at when we look at police brutality, when we look at the economic structure. We really, when we really look at it, we've gotten so far, but was pushed so far back as well, and at this point, that's why we have to really talk about economics and how we can liberate our own freedom, have our own freedom in our own neighborhoods when it comes to owning our businesses and owning our homes and things of that sort. Because when we were fighting for these causes, what happened was they said, okay, yeah, we'll give you this, but they created white supremacist systems to hold us back from still achieving the American dream. So when you talk about integration, we weren't prepared, right, really, for integration. And that opened that racial wealth gap way larger than it was. We were spending our money with each other, and then we started spending the majority of our money outside of the community. And so you can look at many things and say, we have come so far, but you can also look at a lot of the things going on today and say, we were pushed back even further in a lot of areas. So when I look at today and I look at the 1960s, we still have white supremacists in this country. We still look at the Trump era. We still have racism is alive and well. We still have oppression in every form of fashion, but it is just covered up a little bit more than it was back then. And so today, while we're still dealing with a lot of the issues that we were dealing with back in the 60s, they have just, massaged it to where it looks like we're free on the surface, but in the background, we're still being oppressed. So we still have a long way to go. When we're talking about all of the things that we're talking about today, they were talking about those same things and 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 demand for immediate change, and stop allowing them to give us peanuts, or stop allowing them to give us symbolism or holidays or statues or whatever the case is, without giving us real tangible results. When you look at every group of people, other folks, even the Asian community, when they had Asian hate during COVID, they came back and they got a bill. When you look at the immigrant community, they put in the Office of New Americans 8 days after Joe Biden's presidency, introduced it, and then he signed it on the 28th of January. But when you look at HR, when you look at the study of reparations, we've been studying it for decades. So HR 40 has still been sitting there, not going anywhere. So we got to understand that they're not giving us real tangible results, and we have to fight for it. Not just symbolism, but we need bills, we need economics, we need grants, we need funding. We need to build up our own economic structure in our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Jamal. Another panelist.
Yeah, I want to talk about two different areas. So one is policing and the commonalities between 1960s policing and how we talk about it today. And then the other one is voting rights and voting access. So when it comes to policing in the 1950s, 60s, Black folks were clear that the police were not there to protect them. And in fact, I mean, we just talked about all of those iconic photos of police officers using fire hoses and dogs and batons against Black people, clearly showing up not to protect and certainly not to advance our rights. And I think we see very similar conversations today here in the 2020s of Black neighborhoods and Black people being pretty clear that police officers aren't here to protect us. And that when it comes to addressing issues of crime or violence in our own communities, we are really clear that we can't arrest our way out of that problem. We can't be policed out of that problem. Instead, it's going to really depend on us coming together as a community to really address our internal problems. And deal with those issues. And so I'm really intrigued by that parallel between the usefulness or the lack of usefulness of policing when it comes to how Black communities are cared for, and how we still don't necessarily find ourselves here all these years longer feeling necessarily protected by police. And again, we have to remember, I think as many of those who are aware of African American history, we're not surprised that police aren't always the most useful thing. Police were, instituted in these United States in order to begin as slave catchers to catch enslaved Africans who were running free. And so it's not surprising to me that we continue to wrestle with the usefulness of police in our actual communities. And then I want to talk really specifically about the parallels between voting and the conversations around access to voting in the 1950s and 60s and the conversation to the access to voting in 1920. In 2020. And here's the thing, the conversation is scarily similar. The conversation in the 1960s was about access. It was about making sure that people had access to the ballot box, that those of us who are United States citizens, that we have a right, that our democracy depends on. Our power is in the ballot. That was the conversation we were having in 1960s. People literally bled and died for the right to have access to that ballot box. And here we are in 2021, and I think about my own state of Georgia, where once again, we are talking about and fighting for access to the ballot, trying to make sure that every registered voter, every eligible voter is able to get to the ballot box, because we understand, again, that there's power in the box. And once again, just like in the 1960s, we're seeing obstacles being put in the way, roadblocks being put up to prevent people from being able to exercise that fundamental right that comes with becoming of the majority age in this country as a citizen. And so I'm really disturbed to find myself in that place. Here in Georgia, we had a voting a voting law that was put forward that ultimately, again, puts roadblocks in front of us. And my colleague and Senator Lucas, who is one of the longest serving senators that we have, an African-American man who grew up in Macon, and he talked about, I feel like I'm going backwards. I feel like I'm going back to the 1960s where we came from when it comes to voting. And so there are real strong parallels there. And we're going to have to do our work together as a people, as a country, to really fight to move us forward and make sure that people can exercise their fundamental right to vote.
Thank
When I
you,
think
Senator
about-
Jackson. Dr. Robinson.
Yes, when I think about 1961 and 2021, one parallel question is, do Black teachers or Black educators matter? And the answer is yes, but it's raised for different reasons. So 1961 in Mississippi, or could have been Louisiana, Georgia, or where I live now in Virginia, the majority of our Black students, in fact, had Black teachers and Black principals. In some instances, a superintendent or assistant superintendent who worked there. Now, this is, of course, past Brown v. Board of Education 1 and 2. We know that there's a major pushback, Mississippi and the former Confederate states, in terms of the Southern Manifesto and the whole rise of white segregated academies. But as we're trying to make a push in the country to desegregate, integrate, I'll let you pick the term, one of the groups that actually became impacted by this were Black educators and principals. The question is, do Black principals and teachers matter if, in fact, we're trying to integrate schools? We know that a lot of leaders that we have today went to all Black schools throughout the South, both public and private. And the school also served as a place for building leadership in the civil rights movement. And it also played an important role of partnering with local churches and other faith-based communities where African Americans found their tradition. And so they raised the question. And as we began to move toward an idea of integration or segregation, just think of the hundreds, maybe the thousands of principals and teachers who lost their jobs at their schools, who often had their schools merged. And part of the justification was, well, they need to have better teachers, as if our Black teachers didn't matter then. Fast forward to 2021. There are now conversations with 7% of our teachers in the public school system being Black. And we know through research from Constance Lindsay and other scholars that having a Black teacher qualified in his or her subject, you see great gains not only in math and reading, but also self-advocacy and other areas. But still, people are still raising the question, do Black teachers matter? And so when you have people like CEO Peggy Brookins, who is a national board certified teacher, who in fact decided to work closely with people in Mississippi to make sure that we had teachers going through professional development and also having the training inside and outside of schools to prepare them to work with students. And so when you see that Mississippi, again, the only state to see those kind of gains on NAEP, the national report card, it's because we invested in teachers, and a number of those teachers are Black. And so to think today that we're still raising the question of, do Black teachers matter, that should be troubling on one part. But there's also an student achievement part. Even though in 2021, we have more African-American students who finished high school than we did in 1961, the number of my college friends and deans and others who are telling me how many students we're sending to college, who have a high school diploma, who we told were college and career ready, who in fact have to spend 1, 2, sometimes 3 semesters in remediation courses, raising thousands of dollars in debt along the way, oftentimes having to leave. So while I think we've made some gains in some areas, there's some areas in the area of teaching, educators, and achievement that we really should take a look at. And again, it's just something to look at 16 years later.
Thanks, Dr. Robinson. Ms. Travis.
Yes. And I am just so disillusioned with our, and I'm speaking in terms of Mississippi because I hear Dr. Robinson frequently mention Mississippi. But in our Pike, in the local school district, I found that even having, well, my thing is that I don't believe that white teachers can teach Black students effectively. They don't put the time, the energy, the care, compassion, whatever we want to call it. That is not there. They don't care whether those students learn or not. Now, the governor, Phil Bryant, when he was governor in Mississippi, he passed a mandate that schools teach um, civil rights. Is civil rights being taught in the schools? I don't think so. And if it is, I mean, you could probably count them on one hand. When I personally inquired of some of the students, some of the teachers who were teaching in the school system, why aren't y'all teaching civil rights? Well, he mandated it, but he didn't fund it. What do you mean? What do you mean he didn't fund it? You have to order textbooks. Why can't you order textbooks that address civil rights and teach your students? Well, needless to say, it's not happening. And the other thing I found was the schools are failing. Many of the schools are failing in especially the Macomb School District. And I know that I've been made aware that some of the records, what do you call them? I can't. Well, anyway, they're padding the books to give the appearance that the school is doing well and it's progressing. And at one point, the state threatened to come in and take control of the schools. But I mean, it's a sad commentary with the things that I see and the things that I've witnessed, just going to Mississippi and getting involved in trying to do my part in helping to educate our Black people, because it's up to us. We're going to have to do it. We can't depend on them to teach our Black students, because they're not going to fit the bill. Now, speaking in terms of segregating the schools and stuff, Mississippi never integrated the schools. When in let's see what year, I can't recall the year, but when Brown versus Board of Education was to be enforced, um, I won't say Mississippi, I know Macomb, Pike County, Macomb School District. What they did was they closed the high school, which it was Berglund High School, and they changed the name to the principal, who, well, that's another story. They changed the name, and then they opened up private schools for the white students and made it impossible for Black students to attend because they weren't financially stable enough to attend. I understand now there's a couple who are doctors and lawyers who students are attending this Park Lane um, high school, but the Black schools were closed down, then incorporated into the school, which was the white school. They went to that school and called it Macomb High School, which was called something else at the time. But I'm frustrated and disillusioned, and I may not be able to tell it properly, but I know what my heart feels. And my heart feels that we must take control and teach our young people. I know that was something my mother used to say all the time. She said that a person can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't or won't share with others that knowledge, then all that means is that you're just a smart fool. And so I'm going to close on that.
All right.
Thanks, Ms. Travis. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. We have questions coming in, so we ask our audience to keep them coming. But for our next question for our panelists, And this is one that is thought provoking. How can the next generation of freedom fighters continue the work of advocating for equality and equity? And also, what do you see, or who do you see as their greatest obstacle? Anyone? Dr. Robinson.
Well, Dr.
No,
Robinson, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I'll let the young brother go. Go ahead.
No, I appreciate it. Well, I think that for the next generation, we must, let me just say that this new generation, Generation Z, let me just say that they're already amazing. I want to make that clear. These young people are growing up and understanding the challenges, the inequities, they're looking at everything and saying, hey, this is not how we're going to live. When police brutality happens, they're stepping up, they're fighting, they're risking everything to move us forward. They're not the people who, are going to be working the 40-year jobs. They're fighting for liberation. They're the entrepreneurs. They're just different. And so let me just say to Generation Z, millennials open the door. Generation Z, or we cracked it, and Generation Z is just really kicking in the door. And I think what needs to happen is we must teach the things that are that they have not taught us to hold us back. Okay, we must teach finance. We must teach credit. We must teach the stock market. We must teach all of the things that can help us build wealth and build generational wealth. Because if we do not do that, they will continue to be able to do what they do to us because we won't have power. How many of us can come together and fund politicians? The racial gap, the average Black family in America is worth $24,000 to the average white family in America to $188,000. That is a very, very large gap. And so we're not even able to ask our parents to help us put down a down payment or closing costs for a new home. So we have to come together, pool our money, collaborate, be entrepreneurs, be homeowners, teach finance, teach the next generation. That's the only way we're going to have real liberation here in America. They will not give us anything if we don't understand that. If we don't see that everything that we've ever gotten, we've had to fight for it, bleed for it, die for it, march for it, and then they'll give us a little bit and then they'll pull it right back. We talked about voting rights from back in the day. All right, look at what's going on in Georgia. Look at what's going on in Texas. These are things that we fought for, and they want to roll back access to it. We got to understand that, we have to stop financing our own oppression. We got to understand that every dollar that we put out is going somewhere. So if we're giving it to a bank, but they will not reinvest in us, which is why I fought Chase Bank last year, because we were only getting 1.9% of the home loans in the city of Chicago. And if we understand that we can put deposits there and we're paying fees and they're holding our money, but they will not invest back into our businesses, into our homes, then we're funding our own oppression. We're already funding our own oppression on the simple fact that a bank like JP Morgan Chase used 1,700 slaves as collateral to get the wealth that they have today. And now they're worth $3 trillion. And the only thing that they gave us was $1 million scholarship fund when folks found out many years ago. So we got to really understand it. When our dollars go into corporations, what are they funding? If they're funding the prison industrial complex, if they're funding mass incarceration, we're funding our own oppression. All right, private prisons, politicians who move forward policies to only oppress us, who will move forward money into police departments instead of investment into schools and community centers, into neighborhoods. And if we don't understand that, we got to pool our money together and we got to come together so that we can create the reality for us, because they're not going to give it to us. We are going to fail in America. And that's what we must teach the next generation. Unity, collaboration, finance. We got to come together.
I think that one thing that we can do to advance this conversation is to take students on trips domestically and internationally. And here's why. There's a gentleman named Kenneth Mason who works for the Southern Regional Education Board. For over a decade, he's been part of a project connected with a home, in fact, Alex Haley's former home in Tennessee, where he takes students from California to Georgia, New England, Midwest, and elsewhere, and they literally do a civil rights tour along the way. When Representative John Lewis was alive, he would speak to them. But Ken would say two things would happen when we take students. Number one, students in California and Georgia, who otherwise wouldn't see each other except on Facebook or something, being in the same room, talking about civil rights in the geography that it happened. The person in California said, I may be thousands away, 1,000 miles moved away from what took place, let's say in Mississippi, but I see Mississippi in South Central. And then you have students in Georgia who say, yes, I've lived this, but having gone to Mississippi or to Arkansas, Little Rock 9, and those kind of stories, all of a sudden it puts geography beyond just a map, and it puts where they live and their zip code into the broader context. So I think when we can during the summer, even if it's for a week, we should pool our money together, have matching grants for foundations or others, but have students do a civil rights tour. I just give Ken Mason a shout. I think we also need to put our context in an international piece. When you take a look at the civil rights movement in the United States, there were conversations on the continent of Africa, in South America and other places, Europe as well, who were saying, well, what they're going through in Mississippi, we're having some of that in Brixton and in other parts, and well, England, but also in South Africa. And so we took a group of young boys from Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and South Central Los Angeles, and took them on a tour of Senegal and the Gambia. And while they were there, they ended up building bikes to share with the young African students. When we returned home in the United States, after we spent nearly 2 weeks over there, in fact, we happened to go to the village of Jafure, and it was during the 25th anniversary of the showing of Roots. And when they came back home, we had a celebration. Their parents, about a week later, we met in Harlem, and we had a conversation. Their parents said, I don't know what happened on the trip, but they're more serious about school. All of a sudden, they want to read books and talk about history in some ways they have not before, and they're cleaning their room more. But for those young men to see what their peers were going through in Africa had an impact upon them. And one of the sponsors of that trip was Dr. Du Bois' son, who at the time would have been at the university, I think of university in Ghana, I don't remember the name. So domestic and international are something that we can do to make this alive across space and time.
When I think about this next generation of freedom fighters, I think that they get to continue to build on the work that's gone before us and broaden our horizons even bigger than what maybe we can imagine right now today. So I think back on the 1950s, 1960s, and the civil rights movement, and the ways that there were conversations that couldn't be had in public. So the role of women in the civil rights movement and the ways that women were pushed aside. You know, when we kind of name the big civil rights leaders, they're often men. They're often and women were kind of pushed aside. And we didn't talk about in the 1960s. We didn't talk about the ways that women were being oppressed, the ways that queer people and those who are part of the LGBTQ community. While our brains were being used in our strategies, I think about Bayard Rustin, he was pushed back and he was pushed aside. And so now we find ourselves in these 2000s, and we have a new generation of people who are talking about the importance of women's rights and of making sure that we advance issues around the LGBTQ community. And that's so crucial, right? That we've been able to do that. And so there's another frontier that I think the next generation can take us on, a frontier that opens us up and makes sure that we have really important conversations about the ways that we're marginalizing people who are trans, or the marginalization of people who are not United States citizens, or people who are in prison, right? I think there's a whole nother, when it comes to equality, we've got to keep broadening that circle and equity. And so we've done some great work already in advances around race, obviously, which we still must do. But my hope for this next generation is that they will further our work on race, but also take on issues of gender, also take on issues of sexual orientation, in class and all of these other things, so that at the end of the day, this next generation that's already on the grounds, they can say we made the circle wider. We broadened it, and we began to understand and have conversations in public about the ways that other people are being oppressed, and the ways that our system, which was designed to benefit white men for the most part, the ways that we can dismantle that system, so that everybody has an opportunity to really thrive in this world. So that would be my hope for the next generation. And the question was, what is probably the biggest obstacle to the next generation of freedom fighters? And quite frankly, I think it's people who are older than them, who are not able to have these conversations, these more expansive conversations. It's an older generation that's still very much committed to kind of holding on to certain mores and certain respectability politics that maybe worked in the 1960s, but don't necessarily work now, or may not work in the future. I think specifically about, there's been a movement around young people talking about the dress code in their schools. And while it may seem like a really small issue to those of us who don't have to abide by a dress code, for teenagers, it's really important. And they've been highlighting the ways that dress codes are fundamentally misogynistic and encourage rape culture. But there's a lot of people who are my age and older who just aren't ready for that conversation. And we are blocking that conversation. And so I think that we've got to get out of the way. That's going to be a really big thing. We've got to get out of the way and make space for these new expansive conversations and understandings of what it means to bring equality and equity to this country.
Can I piggy? Go ahead, Ms. Travis.
Yeah. I don't know how this is reflecting on our minister's comment. I don't know how far out of the way we can get, because the thing is that there's a blueprint, and I believe that within that blueprint, there's still viable parts of that blueprint that can be utilized by the youth today. And I know we talked about voter registration, voter suppression, and voter suppression is not just, they didn't just pass a voter suppression law in Georgia. They're trying to pass voter suppression laws I believe they said 40 some other states. I believe I stand corrected if I'm wrong, but it's more widespread than it was in the 60s. You had, Mississippi probably being the worst, but you had we have now a number of states who are trying to suppress voting. So, and I believe that in doing so, or realizing this, there again, it goes back to get knocked off, back to teaching. It goes back to teaching. And okay, we got knocked off, but that's okay. It goes back to preparation, actually, preparing these young people for today, tomorrow, and the future. Uh, I find too, many of the young people today sit around and they don't want to do anything. Waiting for their parents or whoever to take care of them and give them what's the term when anyway. But there's another saying that I was taught as a young girl. If you feel the world owes you something, you're never going to have anything. So we have got to continue. And yes, I'm old. I'm a young old lady. So, but I think that even being as old as I am, we still have good ideas, and maybe they may not work for the young people, but they have to continue to work for us. At one time, we used to feel secure in calling the police. I would never call the police on my family or anybody because I don't want to see them end up dead. So these are lessons that we have to teach our young people. We used to always, well, we never felt secure in Mississippi with calling the police. And so and I grew up in Mississippi. I'm a local, well, a Mississippian, and I reside here in California now for 55 years. But Mississippi is still home, and I go back because I feel like I have a contribution to make to the young people there. And I forget whatever other part of the question there was, but I think I've said enough.
Well, I think I think the biggest problem, and you talked about preparation. Let me just say, you with your views, Miss Travis, you have very progressive views, which I love. But when you talk about preparation, the reality is the next generations have not been prepared correctly for this fight. And so what has happened is you've had a lot of folks and civil rights leaders who have been in the past who have not taught another generation of folks, even Black elected officials who've been there for decades, not have a succession plan. And, then they die, and then we're scrambling to figure out how we're going to refill these seats or refill these organizations, et cetera. And so what we have not left the next generations is we've not left them the knowledge, and we have not prepared them for this fight and these injustices. We have not given them any type of wealth. Obviously, if you look at the wealth gap in America today, it is either at the same or even larger gap than it used to be at different times. And so we've really left them with nothing. And so now what happens is, and I'm speaking for myself as well, is that we get to an age where we're tired of seeing something and we say, this isn't right. And so we step up and we find our own way of fighting. And when we do that, elder generation have access to wealth. And that was another thing, is a lot of our leaders and were able to get access to even elected jobs. They got six figures. A lot of them were able to figure out how to make money in their organization. They were finding ways to create revenue for themselves. And so they're holding on to that without preparing the next generation. So these generational fighters, think of the 50 states from George Floyd, all these folks that have been protesting. There's no budget for this. A lot of these people are just folks who stepped up and said, I'm going to organize a protest and let's come out tomorrow and let's fight. And that's because we have no strategy or organizations who have real ties to the communities anymore, who don't have any resources either, or not allocating the resources to these type of fights. And that just has to change. I think that's going to change with millennials and Generation Z. And hopefully for the next future generations, we're helping to prepare them. We're putting them in a succession plan. We're creating the next generation of leaders, because we got to understand that today's fight may still be a fight in 30 years. And we got to make sure that we're prepared for that.
Thank you, Mr. Green. And thank you all for those thoughtful responses. And Senator Jackson, something that you said resonated with me and reminded me of one of the most profound quotes I've heard from Freedom Summer. And it was a young man who said, my freedom is entangled with the freedom of every other man. So if another man is not free, then I am not free.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a powerful quote for this generation and next generations to think about is inclusivity and working on behalf of everyone. And in this particular conversation, of course, working on behalf of Black America. Now we are at a moment where we are going to turn to questions from our audience, and we do have a few, and we will try to get as many as possible in. And we will also have those in the chat box for our panelists after I have articulated each of those. But our first question for the evening, and we thank you all who did get around to submitting questions, but our first question for the evening is, our government bodies remain disproportionately white. Would more diversity make a difference in civil rights progress in 2021? And if so, how do we achieve that? And any of our panelists are invited to answer that question. And the question again is in the chat.
Yeah, I want to go ahead and speak to that. I think the idea of having more diversity, does that make a difference? Ultimately, yes. I think that it's inherently important for our state houses and our federal levels for the demographics to reflect the nature of our community. In Georgia, we talk about, and this is true, I think, across the country, it's the people's house. And so because it's the people's house, the people should look like the people inside of that place. I will say I'm the only out state senator in Georgia. I'm the only LGBTQ person there. And my presence when it comes to LGBTQ issues, being there, it has made a difference. There's less hatefulness. Now, bills are still introduced that are harmful to my community. There's no doubt about that. But the rhetoric is dialed down. The rhetoric is different. It's hard to speak really hatefully about a community when there's a member in that room. And when I think about in Georgia, I mean, we actually do have a substantial amount of African American elected officials who are serving in the House and the Senate, and we're able to introduce bills that are about our community. We're having a long conversation in Georgia about expanding opportunities for sports betting and other types of gambling. And at the core of that conversation is making sure that whatever revenue comes as a result of that new type of gambling, that Black and brown communities will benefit from that. Right? If we only let white legislators sit in the room and make these decisions, they're going to think about the people they know. They're going to look out for their family members. And that's natural, right? But when you add diverse voices into that conversation, then you begin to expand and broaden. I have the great privilege of representing a community of refugees. There are over 80 different countries represented in my district, 80 different languages that are spoken here. And so every time we introduce new legislation, I'm thinking about, how does this impact my community of new Americans? How does this help make refugees who've come from Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever else? How does this legislation make their entry into the state a little bit better? And so that diversity is absolutely crucial when it comes to advancing and making progress in our nation, because you simply can't, and one person cannot represent everybody. It's just not possible. So you need more people with more diversity in order to more broadly and more fairly represent everybody. Oh, and I guess let me add to the second piece of that. The second question is, how do we achieve that? Well, we elect Black people, right? We elect people who come from these diverse places. And also it might mean, and it will mean, in fact, that white people step back. This is, the young brother talked about making sure we have a succession plan. Well, we need white politicians who believe in progress and who understand the value of equity and diversity. We need them to mentor candidates of color and to step back and to make room, understanding that when they step back, our state get better because of that diversity.
I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, and it comes out whichever way it comes out. When I look at people like Tim Scott, when I look at that man that sits up there on the Supreme Court, a Black man, and I remember what that general said, they may be our color, but they're not our kind. We have to be careful about who we put in office to represent us, be it Black or white, gay, straight, Indian, whoever. We have to be careful and closely scrutinize these people before we put them in office to represent us. So
I agree. Let me just say that. A lot of terrible policies and rulings have came from people that look like us. We That is the
Us,
worst type
absolutely.
of people. That the folks who look like us but are not working in our best interest. We can look at the Supreme Court and understand that. Okay, so I totally agree. And I think, as we have to move away from the symbolism and we have to fight on policy. I was a surrogate for Bernie Sanders for 2 election cycles, and it's not about identity. I don't care what he looks like. I don't care if he's white, old, whatever. All the stuff they used to use on him. I care about the fact that too many Americans are riddled with debt, and that affects our economic progression. Yes, that's important to me. I care about the fact that we have a terrible quality of healthcare, and everybody should have the same quality of healthcare in America. It was the policies legalizing cannabis and expunging records so that folks can have a second chance. It was just so many different policies that we went to, and so we have to stop with the symbolism. I don't care the color. I don't care what they look like, how they look like. I don't care any of those things. What was the agenda you're going to move forward to represent our people? And that is what we must focus on.
Yeah, I,
Mhm.
I just want to push back a little bit and say I policy matters absolutely, and we've already alluded to some people, some Black people who have had really terrible policies that haven't advanced us. And I want to be clear that representation does matter. Having more women at the table makes a difference in the quality and the kind of conversation that we're having when it comes to policy. Having more Black people at the table who've been vetted, who we understand, who have progressive politics, who actually love Black people is really important. And I don't want to ever underestimate the power of having the types of people who are making policy at the table. So if we're going to make policy about women's bodies, we need to have women at the table. If we're going to make policies that impact Black school children in our school systems, then we need to have Black people and Black parents at the table. When we make policies that impact how we deal with issues of disability, those folks need to be at the table having that conversation, because we understand more intimately, more better than anyone else, what it is to be in our Black body and our Black skin. So I don't want to, yes, policy matters 100%. And I support white candidates who have great policy. And I want to make sure we continue to make space and create room for Black candidates and Black elected officials, because we do bring something that is special and unique to the table that is often missing when you don't have somebody who comes from our background at that table. I just want to be really clear about that.
Thanks.
And I'll let me real quick, because I do have to exit a little early, but you are totally correct, as a rep, and we do need representation. They just must be vetted. We must stop voting for people based on identity politics. And
Mhm.
I don't care. We ought to stop
Mhm.
saying, "Oh, because she's Black, or because she's this or he's that,
Mhm.
we're going to vote for
Mhm.
him." No, we must vet them and make sure the policies are correct. Like, some of yours seem to be, Rep Jackson. So representation definitely matters, but they must be vetted. And we got to stop being fooled by the media and by our two-party system. We got to understand that we know our agenda and what works for our people. We must make sure that we have people that represent that, not being fooled or tricked by folks who really aren't from where we from, and just saying what they need to say just to get in. So I want to say that, and I want to thank everybody for having me on this panel as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thanks,
My, I
Jamal,
wanted to,
and thanks for joining us. Miss Travis, before we go to the next question, Miss Travis.
yes. Um, I wanted to reflect on what he was just saying, and the thing is that when we select representatives, we try to select people that we can identify with, people that we think that understand us, and not just being a politician and getting up there saying what we think, what they think that we want to hear. Um, when you speak in terms of vetting people, yes, we need to put people in the offices that understand the issues and don't just have, if they don't understand the issues, then they don't understand the answer. They don't have an answer. They don't know what to fight for. They don't know how to vote or how to properly represent us if they don't understand our issues. And that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Ms. Travis.
Mhm.
Just to shift gears, we have another question from our viewing audience, and it asks, if protesting in the street isn't your thing, how can you contribute to the movement? Great question. If protesting isn't your thing, how can you contribute to the movement?
Well, there are a number of ways that they can contribute to the movement. And one of the main ways, as someone spoke or alluded to earlier, is raising funds. You know, the lifeblood of any organization or any movement are finances. And so that's one of the ways. And the other one is to, they used to have phone banks, have people calling, soliciting, and getting people out to protest in whatever way it can. Just calling people and asking them to address the issues and see what they think. But one of the main ways would be to raise funds to make sure that the individuals who are out there on the front lines can continue. You know.
Another way that people can contribute to the movement is through mentorship. So take someone like Septima Clark. Her name isn't well known in the civil rights movement or the work that she was doing with the Highlander School in Tennessee, but she was a mentor to Dr. King as a young man, talking to him about not only organizing, but about ideas. She's someone who said, I like chaos because from chaos comes creativity. And you didn't often see her on the front line in the streets or protesting in the ways that we're talking about tonight. You also take someone like Dr. Howard Thurman. Most people don't know a great deal about him. He was also a mentor to Dr. King, but through his books on Jesus and the Disinherited to working with a number of faith traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and otherwise, he says, no, you won't find me in the streets, but you'll find me in maybe some corporate suites, or you'll find me in an academic suite. So that's another way of doing it. You can also participate through having conversations like this. That's one to thank Ms. Berry for deciding to put this together and make it happen in the same way that Lynn, who was at Ford Foundation, decided to fund Eyes on the Prize. We can do that. And another thing you can do as a young person, because they often say, well, I'm not old enough to vote. I said, but you vote every time you decide you want to do your homework. And every time you decide you want to be the best student you can be. And you may have troubles along the way, but if you're putting forward your best effort, that's a way of showing protest. Now, think about the fact that earlier I'd mentioned about the Tougaloo Nine. What I didn't mention is naturally, of course, they were arrested. And why were they arrested? Because they went into a library and decided they actually wanted to read. And they called it a read-in. And then the police arrested them and said, they don't have a permit. They were disturbing the peace. Well, what we often don't talk about is at the same time, 5,000 whites were involved in their own march to celebrate the fact that 100 years ago, Mississippi had left the Union. And so there are different ways of being involved without being in the streets. Academic suites, mentorship, but also finding ways to help young people and others walk across the line.
Mhm.
Yeah, and as the designated, I guess, government representative here, I want to name the importance of getting involved in policy, whether that's from your local policy, going to a school board meeting, a city council or county, however your local government runs, all the way to the state house. It's interesting. I think people believe that it's a little harder to advocate in the state capitol than it actually is. We're just people, elected officials. We're human beings who go home every day day, just like the rest of us. And so, writing a letter, dropping by the Capitol, like make an appointment to meet and talk to your elected officials about legislation that matters to you, that helps advance the issues of civil rights is really important. And whether that's you go in person or send an email or write a letter, all of those ways are a part of being in the movement. And then one of the things I like to encourage people is to remember that this work towards equity in this country, it's not just about federal policies or state level policies. It's across the board. It's in corporations, right? It's in the academic suites and the C suites too. It's wherever you are. And so wherever you're employed, I encourage you to begin to ask the questions of, are we thinking about equity in this place? Are women being paid an equal wage to the men who work here? Are African Americans or people of color being paid in the same way? Are opportunities for advancement, are they equal? Do we have equal access across fields? So whether that's you're a school teacher and you're thinking about how your school operates, or you are working in, I don't know, a mill here in Georgia where you are processing chickens, asking those questions and really pushing and encouraging us to think about all of our organizations through a racial equity lens is a part of doing this movement work. And it's a really important part of doing this movement work. So yes, give money. If you're not in the streets protesting person, I get that, but please, talk about policy, talk about issues of equity wherever you are, because the only way that we're going to really truly advance in this nation is if we attack it in every different institution, not just our government institutions, but across the field.
And just a quick follow up on the importance of policy. When we often talk about policy, we talk to young people about the importance of going through the legislative branch. And of course, that's important. But once the law is signed by a governor, it then finds itself in a regulatory agency. And often we don't find our community going to state board meetings. Of course, there's a gap in time and distance. But I would say when we think about policy, think about regulations and think about rulemaking that takes place in administrative agencies, be it state, local, or federal, because that's often an aspect of policy we totally let go. A law is signed, we throw confetti, we're done. Trust me, having worked in the position where I had a chance to write and support rules and regulations with a board of education, there's a lot of power and a lot of things that take place, and we need to make sure that's part of the policy conversation.
Yes.
Thank you. So ways of contributing to the movement when you don't feel comfortable with taking to the streets for protests. Of course, funding, financial support, mentorship and education, and also policy is what we heard from our panelists just now. We have time for one last question for our panelists. And I think that these are some powerful responses to the questions that have been asked, and also some powerful questions as well. But what do you say to Americans who say there's no systemic racism and that everything was fixed in the 1960s? Is there a way to change minds and hearts?
My job as an Episcopal priest is that I serve a congregation of people who are experiencing homelessness in downtown Atlanta. And I tell people I already believed in systemic racism before I started that job. But there's nothing that reminds me more of the systemic injustice and the systemic racism of this entire country than when I go to downtown Atlanta and I look at the people who are sleeping outside, and 85% of them are African American, in a city in which we are not 85% of the population. For me, that reality is really stark. It's very clear and it's undeniable. I think about when I've gone to my public school systems and compared so we're going to use an Atlanta reference. When I compare kind of North Atlanta public schools and even just the outside of the buildings, the way that their schools look like college campuses. And then I go down to South DeKalb, where my wife taught a school and a high school where they didn't have enough desks for all of the kids to sit in one classroom, where it's a whole bunch of Black kids. Those things, for me, it's impossible to not see that there's systemic injustice in it. So I think for many people, it's about giving themselves, sometimes we don't have the eyes to see, but other times it's because we just don't want to see. And so inviting people to actually open their eyes and see who is it that's impacted by poverty in such massive numbers, it's not accidental. Unless you believe that Black people are inherently inferior, then you have to understand that we are subjected to levels of poverty, not because of who we are, but because of a system that is greatly unjust. So I want to encourage people, go to your downtowns, see who's sleeping outside. Go and look at your school system. You don't have to go inside of them. Look at the school buildings for the majority white kids, and that might be a white flight private school that was built in the 1950s, and go to the school that serves majority Black children, and then begin to see, because it's there, it's right there in front of you.
Okay, I have a response to that as well. If we reflect back on just a few short months ago, the man that sat in that White House as the president, I don't think it could get any more systemic than that. Calling Black people from Africa, whole countries, or people from Mexico being rapists and murderers. Living here in California, we even discriminate against one another, race against race. I know that there is an issue with Hispanics and Blacks. And many times, and I've experienced this on a personal level, they come across the border and look down immediately, not just with Hispanics, but Asians. This is truth time. Asians who look down, I often think of that harlot, little young schoolgirl, Natisha Harlan, who was killed by an Asian woman, and she never spent not one day in jail. That, to me, as well, is systemic racism. Had it been the other way around, the person would have gotten life. So we have a lot of issues that are going on. And whereas Black people are usually the first one to hit the line, on the front line, to fight and defend those same people that come into this country and look down on us. So yeah, they're it's not just the government, it's what the government has prepared them to do when they enter this country, because we never mattered.
So I have friends of mine who say that systemic racism is over. And I say, well, how do you make that conclusion? You have a Black president. In 1961, you didn't have as many members of the Congressional Black Caucus in DC than you do now. Georgia, Virginia, other states have it. I said, okay, interesting. I said, then explain this. I said, America makes up 5% of the world's population, and we make up 35% of the Nobel laureates. How do you explain that? And they said, it's American exceptionalism. I said, okay. I said, African-American students in the public school sector make up 15% of the population, but over 42% of the suspensions. What do you call that? They said, a statistical anomaly. I said, that's interesting. I said, so on one area, 5%, 35 is exceptionalism. And when we come to Black students, it's a statistical anomaly. Well, if you use that logic, how do you explain the disproportionate number of Black women who are finding themselves incarcerated for crimes that their white colleagues committing the same crime often won't have the same sentence? How do you explain the fact that you have Black women with PhDs who are applying for jobs and finding themselves overlooked by someone who's less qualified? How about an apples to apples comparison where you took someone who had a criminal record, Black person, a white person with a criminal record? You say, well, that'd be the same. Well, what about the white person with a criminal record and the Black person without one, and more calls going to the white person with a criminal record than someone without that? We can call it a statistical anomaly if we want to. Systemic racism is real. We're definitely further in 2021 as a nation than we were in 1961. But to think that simply having Black faces in high places is an example that things are all changed, we have no problems, I just think that's moonwalking in fantasy, and that's not my world.
Yep.
Thank you to all of our panelists. And of course, our evening has come to a close. Again, I am Daphne Chamberlain, Associate Professor of History at historic Tougaloo College, and it has been my pleasure serving as moderator. I would like to thank all of our viewing audience for the questions that were submitted, and of course, again, to all of our panelists. At this time, I will turn everything back over to Deborah. And Deborah, again, to you and USA Today, thank you for the opportunity.
For that powerful and important conversation. Tonight we're going to have a reading from Tracy K. Smith. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet who served as the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019. Tracy is going to read her own work and also the work of Camilla Aisha Moon. Camilla was the author of Starshine and Clay, and She Has a Name. She was scheduled to read from her work during our event in December, but she recently passed away. We are very saddened by her loss. Thank you, Tracy, for sharing your work and hers.
Thank you. It's been just a privilege to be able to sit and listen to the insightful conversation. And these questions are perennial. We have been living with and struggling with them for generations. And it's really beautiful to hear new vocabulary and to hear new ways of thinking about the past in this space. One of the things that I do as an artist is try to think about ways that I can contribute to a shift or even maybe a reconfiguration of the collective imagination, which I feel has a large bearing upon the way that we see one another, the opportunities that we seek out and that we're given access to, the future that we as a nation imagine ourselves to be working toward. Poetry is my tool for contributing to that work because I feel that it gives us fuller access to what I imagine is the full sweep of time. A poem can remind you of how close to one another the past, the present, and the future actually are, and how they are in constant dialogue with one another. Dialogue that we, in our words and actions, can also shift and expand. I think poetry also urges us to admit that we are inextricably implicated in the suffering and also the thriving of one another, which is something that so many voices and forces in our culture would have us ignore. The last thing I'll say before I read the poems is I was so moved by Mr. Neblett singing Eyes on the Prize at the opening of the evening. The line, "I've never been to heaven, but I know I'm right," stays in my ear. It's a mantra, it's a heartbeat, it's a form of assurance and admonition. It tells us, hold on, because we can't afford not to act when we know we are in the right. I think poems have the ability to serve a similar kind of purpose as freedom songs. I'd like to read this poem by Camilla Aisha Moon, who was a poet, prophetic in her vision, huge in her compassion, and deeply committed to justice, to the power and sanctity of Black life, and to hope. This is a poem called Fannie Lou Hamer, and it opens with Hamer's famous statement, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." She sat across the desk from me, squirming. It was stifling. My suite runs hot, but most days it is bearable. This student has turned in nothing, rarely comes to class. When she does, her eyes bore into me with a disdain born long before either of us. She doesn't trust anything I say. She can't respect my station, the words coming out of these lips, this face. My breathing is an affront. "It's me," she says. "I never was this student's professor." Her immediate reaction, seeing me at the smart board. But I have a calling to complete, and she has to finish college, return to a town where she doesn't have to look at, listen to, or respect anyone like me, forever tall, large, and brown in her dagger eyes, though it's clear she looks down on me. She can return, if not to her hometown, another enclave, so many others, where she can brush a dog's golden coat, be vegan, and call herself a good person. Are you having difficulty with your other classes? No. Go, I say, tenderly. Loaded as a cop's gun, she blurts point blank that she's afraid of me. Twice. My soft syllables rattle something planted deep, so I tell her to go where she'd feel more comfortable, as if she were my niece or godchild, even wish her a good day. If she stays, the ways this could backfire. Where is my Kevlar shield from her shame? There's no way to tell when these breasts will evoke solace or terror. I hate that she surprises me, that I lull myself to think her ilk is gone, despite knowing so much more and better. I can't proselytize my worth all semester, exhaust us for the greater good. I can't let her make me a monster to myself. I'm running out of time and pity the extent of her impoverished heart. She's from New England. I'm from the Mid-South. Far from elderly, someone just raised her like this, with love. I have essays to grade, but words warp on the white page, dart just out of reach. I blink 2 hours away, find it hard to lift my legs, my voice, my head precious to my parents, now being held in my own hands. How did they survive so much worse, the millions with all of their scars? What would these rivers be without their weeping? These streets without their faith and sweat? Fannie Lou Hamer thundered what they felt, we feel, into DNC microphones on black and white TV years before I was a notion. She doesn't know who Fannie Lou Hamer is and never has to. It's Camila Aisha Moon, a poem that tells a hard truth, which is something I think poems are good at doing. I want to offer a poem that speaks to what feels like a beautiful wave of hope, of determination, of vision and activism and power that is surging up in us, in the community of Blackness. And I think that has the power to bring about beautiful change. This is called We Feel Now a Largeness Coming On. Being called all manner of things from the dictionary of shame, not English, not words, not heard, but worn, born, carried, never spent. We feel now a largeness coming on, something passing into us. We know not in what source it was begun, but wrapped, we watch it rise through our fallen, our slain, our millions dragged, chained, like daylight setting leaves alight, green to gold to blinding white, like a spirit caught, flame in flesh. I watched a woman try to shake it once from her shoulders and hips, a wild, annihilating fright. Other women formed a wall around her, holding back what clamored to rise. God, devil, ancestor, what Black bodies carry through your schools, your cities? Do you see how mighty you've made us, all these generations running? Every day, steeling ourselves against it. Every day, coaxing it back into coils. And all the while, feeding it. And all the while, loving it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Smith. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Thank you. That was powerful. Very powerful. I want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight and encourage you to check out USA Today's 7 Days of 1961. You can find it at 7daysof1961.usatoday.com. It launched last week with a series of stories, and including some with first-person accounts from some of the veterans themselves. We will continue to roll out this project through December with installments in October and November. In fact, some are coming out next week. But take note, there's also stories, there's podcast series, there's several graphic novels, there's educational material, and more. We really hope you take some time to check out our project. Good night, everyone. Be well.